No more slums, no more dungeons. Every Demacian a king.
Tragedy for the prince who has lost his father to murder. Tragedy for Sylas and his group that they weren't able to kill him first, nor humiliate him in front of his own very people. Now, he decides that they must stand trial before the people, before his execution. Jarvan pleaded for mercy, even stating his love for someone who wasn't as different to the mages. But of course, that wasn't enough for Sylas. Now, before he would be sentenced to death, Sylas offered him one last meal, a meal that was familiar to him when he was in prison, all now for the prince to try. But before the worst could even happen, Lux came from behind to confront him, shouting to let Jarvan go. Sylas tried to persuade her to not side with the suppressors, but with them, the oppressed. Lux didn't budge, instead shot her crossbow. Before Sylas could act, however, a loud shout from the crowd. "Hello, mage! Ready to finish this?" The shout came from Garen, who pushed through the crowd of civilians and rebelling mages alike, all in the hopes to strike his foe down and to free the prince. Sylas thought it better to retreat instead of losing any more lives. By the end of the chaos, hundreds of mages fled, and the kingdom mourned the loss of their king. With the newly crowned King Jarvan IV, he gave his promise and swore to the people that order within Demacia shall be restored, the king's murder brought to justice, and that the scourge of magic eradicated forever from the kingdom, by a fury that has never been seen before. Much later, throughout different corners of the kingdom and the great city, Mage Seekers began to show more of their presence within the streets, arresting any suspects who shown signs of being a mage, or simply those who held sympathies towards them. Young and old, dangerous or harmless, every person with even a trace of magical abilities were taken away from their homes and families. This unsettled Lux, who witnessed these systemic arrests, but Garen argued otherwise, saying the only way to stay safe is to keep their heads down, even if what was happening around them wasn't right. Lux met this sentiment with opposition, stating that it isn't fair to the people. Garen, however, argued that it wasn't about fairness, but about preservation. Preservation of the kingdom and of her. Lux pointed out that she has never seen her older brother this scared before. Though his fears were valid, he said that the Mage Seekers were going to search every single door in the kingdom, and that means every door. They'll also have suspicions of Lux for her connections to Sylas, and even have questions on his escape. In secret thereafter, Lux decided to help mages to escape. One instance, she rescued 2 children who were about to be taken away by the Mage Seekers. She would take the children to a family living within the distant farmlands, and offer them a chance to escape. The only route they could take without rousing any suspicion were the sewers, and, as a thanks, one of the mages gave Lux their staff for her to keep. As they made their way through the dark paths of the underground, they discovered that the exit that led to the other side was blocked by a rubble of rocks. It seems that Sylas blocked it off to ensure no one would follow. At first, they ought to turn around, but suddenly, someone emerged from the darkness to halt them. It was Garen. His expression, however, was more disheartened than anger. "Lux, why? Why are you forcing me to do this?" "Nobody's forcing you to do anything. You make your own decisions. I gave you a way out. All you had to do was help the Mage Seekers, and I made the decision to help them instead. Garen couldn't even bear to look at his sister, but still, he warned her not to go any further. Lux didn't budge, then warned everybody to stand clear away from the rubble. Then, in a bright burst of light filled the dark corners, followed by a loud boom, as a power beam of light burst through the rubble. Now, with the escape route cleared, the family, along with the two children, made their way through, all for their freedoms. Well, aren't you going to say anything? Says Lux to her brother. So, this is what you are now, Garen replied, his gaze lowered facing to the ground. It's what I've always been. You know that. You're... Say it. Garen then raised his head, his eyes now looking at his sister, and letting out a sigh. You're a mage. My sister is a mage. And a Demacian. With those words, the two Crown Guard siblings embraced. Then, Lux turned away and followed the other mages, telling them they should try to find a place to camp for the night. On the other side, Garen returned to the surface and went to meet with Jarvan IV. The king gave his thanks and gratitude, saying that Garen, his close friend, and now right-hand man, is a true Demacian. But Garen's gaze was lowered to the floor. The laws that he has been taught and preached throughout his life seems to have a shadow cast upon them now. Meanwhile, upon a stone dais, one figure who sat cross-legged in the citadel was the Lord Seneschal, Xin Zhao, his spear laid across his lap as he watched the first sunrise turning the pale stone to gold upon his adopted homeland. He sat still, feeling the weight of his failures in protecting the now late king, the most honorable man he had ever met. The day of the uprising he had been wounded, which led to his absence from the king's side. The guards couldn't tell how long he had sat, but they left him to fall under his despair within his grief. But Xin Zhao soon stood to his feet, before heading back inside. The gardens always brought him solace. Once he walked through the palace halls, a tattered banner came to his view. This was the banner where he and the late King Jarvan III stood side by side in battle, battling against Freljordian raiders from the north. Xin later went and wandered to the library, where he and Jarvan III spent the late nights discussing scholarly works, drinking mead, even training together in sparring sessions with swords, spears, and lances. He later got himself out of reminiscing old memories as he heard the clash of weapons coming from the training room. As he entered, he saw the young prince, who's now the new king, swinging a sword at a wooden dummy. As Zen was about to turn and leave, Jarvan IV called to him. Though they were not related by blood, their bond was strong, as if they were family, and called him uncle. It was after this moment that Jarvan tossed Xin a blunt training sword, which was followed up with a sudden attack. Xin was able to block. He could tell from the young king's red and bagged eyes that he's attacking through his grief. Jarvan shouted at him on where he was when his father was murdered. Xin did not answer, only muttering that he wished that he was there. But within Xin's mind, he recalled the very last conversation and the very last orders that were given to him by the late king. he was given an order to deliver a sealed letter to the leader of the Mage Seekers. Even if it wasn't explicitly said to him, Jarvan III's words of regret in blaming himself of giving them too much power, Zin knew that the letter was meant to cease the existence of the Mage Seekers. Back in the present, Jarvan IV dropped his training sword. Thinking that he was done, Zin then saw Jarvan picked up a legendary weapon, a lance masterfully crafted by Demacia's first king Orlon, Drakebane. After it was picked up, Jarvan pressed Zin with another attack. This time, Zin began to use his own spear. The rough sparring, to say the least, ended with Jarvan thrusting Drakebane only inches from Zin's neck. The Lord Seneschal muttered again that he wished that he was there by the king's side. The saying made the young king break down into tears, leading the two men to comfort each other in an embrace, with this being the first time a tear traced down Xin Zhao's face. Once the emotions finally settled, Jarvan IV and Xin Zhao pressed towards their duties. As they stopped at the entrance of the meeting room, Jarvan asked Xin about the supposed letter, but it was never delivered, and was still attached to Xin's belt. He then handed over the letter to Jarvan, but he didn't read it. He crushed it in his hand before it was handed back, asking Xin to destroy it. Xin was shocked, but he couldn't bring himself to question the king. The two men then entered the room, where Xin saw Captain Crownguard and her husband, the leader of the Mage Seekers, Lord Eldred. In the silence after the destructive events, the kingdom of Demacia still stood, but ever since the uprising, it now feels grey. The Mage Seekers continue to roam and search every home in the kingdom, inciting further fears upon their people. Far from the populated areas of the great city, far out in the country, not wanting to go with Sylas, Lux founded her own refugee settlement for mages, in which she would shelter mages who did not want to get involved in the civil war, but build new lives. Then deep within the dark forests, where no soldiers dared to venture, the wanted man Sylas had begun to seek allies to further push for the revolution. He met a spellcrafter named Leilani, who led a group of rebel mages in Zephyra, and agreed to teach him how to fight. In exchange, they decided to focus on the snake's head. They would target and kill the leader of the Mage Seekers, Lord Eldred Crownguard, husband to Tiana Crownguard, and uncle to Garen and Lux. Though the citizens of the kingdom tried their best to live their lives, despite the height of tensions, it could not be said the same for the Mage Seekers. Multiple raids in many parts of the country targeted their outposts. From Thornbarrow to the Clarion Cove, revolutionaries stormed through to obtain supplies, weapons, and new recruits. One of the raids that were carried out by the rebels was a rescue of Leilani's old mentor, Kara Doran, a descendant of the famous artisan, Arcturus Doran. With the revolution ever growing, in one instance, Sylas saw a dark feather, sensing a faint, yet powerful magic emitting from it. From his time of imprisonment, when Lux gave him multiple books to read, he recalled the tale of the Veiled Lady. Then, Leilani inspected the feather to see if she could make something out of it. Information, to be specific. She, along with her mentor Kara, concluded that the very tales whom Sylas believed were mere propaganda were true. He was later tasked in finding the whereabouts of the lady, scouring the dark forest for any trace of where she may be. Sylas soon comes across a trail of ancient magic. Believing it to be a sign from the Veiled Lady, he follows it into the sacred woods, a deeper part of the dark forest where magic is more ancient than the Demacian textbooks wouldn't dare to acknowledge. Eventually, after a wary wander through the dark, the trail leads into the abode of Morgana, the true identity of the Veiled Lady. Despite this being their first ever meeting, Morgana told Sylas that she was already acquainted with his quest and his cause. Sylas then asked for her assistance in helping the revolution, but Morgana instead wanted to test him and challenged him to a duel. It was a clash of powerful magic within the sacred forest, but in a final blow, Morgana binds Sylas with her soul shackles and learns about him through his pain. She notes of Sylas' reluctance to embrace leadership despite being looked up to by so many. He retorts he is only suited for battle. She later releases the chains and brought him further into her sanctuary. Once they were indoors, Morgana shares a vision of a better future for Demacia, but emphasizes the need for a teacher that could steer its people in believing that magic is of no harm. However, Sylas' goal of killing Eldred spares no interest in becoming a said teacher. She questions how vengeance could still drive Sylas after many years, and whether he can ever be satisfied. He asserts his intention to keep fighting until the end, believing there will always be people like Eldred. She then asks what he would sacrifice in the pursuit of freedom, whether he would renounce even his thirst for vengeance in the name of a greater cause. Sylas firmly declares that vengeance is his cause. This left Morgana disappointed, seeing that Sylas wasn't worthy of her blessing. And since she was deciding to turn away, she reveals she possesses a weapon that the Mage Seekers fear. She suggested that it could potentially reshape Demacia altogether, but she doubts Sylas, driven by vengeance, possesses the strength to wield it. Back at the camp, where the revolutionaries were, Sylas returned empty-handed. With the encounter past them, Sylas would lead his rebels to assault the great city once again, battling their way through the defending Demacian army and their Mage-Seeker allies. The battle was ferocious and bloody. Neither side would falter before their foes. In the heat of battle, Sylas once again encounters Garen in the assault, but triumphs in their rematch and prepares to finish him off. Leilani quickly interjects, saying they will lose Lux's help if they ever kill their brother. Sylas begrudgingly spares the captain's life and regroups with the rebel forces at the makeshift camp before their assault upon the royal palace. The dawn broke to more cries of bloodshed, as the rebel mages battled against the Demacians. After carving through their defenses, Sylas eventually reached Eldred's office. The two then locked into a duel, but Sylas soon overpowered the leader of the Mage Seekers and slayed him. When he made his way out, King Jarvan IV and a unique purple-skinned woman clashed against him. This purple woman was Shyvana, the person that Jarvan mentioned he loves. This mattered little to Sylas, viewing Shyvana's allegiance to the king as blasphemous. He struggled against the two, but eventually he was able to wound both the king and the half-dragon. But then, he received ill news that the rebels were losing the battle against the Demacian army. He had to make a choice, helping his allies or killing the king. Sylas decided to retreat from the wounded duo to help his fellow rebels survive the fight. but their retreat was now in a dire spot as Mage Seeker reinforcements arrived, led by Eldred's second in command, Wisteria. Her petrified staff that had absorbed countless amounts of magic from fallen mages then unleashed directly against the rebels. With no other options at their disposal, Leilani casted a powerful reflection spell at the cost of her own life, which bought Sylas and the revolutionaries the chance to escape. Now returned to the camp within the Dark Forest. The rebel mages suffered heavy losses, but the biggest loss they suffered was Leilani. Even if they looked at Sylas as their symbol, it was Leilani who gave them orders and made the crucial decisions. Sylas, now in grief, finally understood what Morgana meant about vengeance. He trekked his way through the sacred path once again and returned to where she settled. Once there, he admits that his rage alone isn't enough to win this war. Leilani knew this, but died because of Sylas's actions. Seeing him humbled by his failure, Morgana shows him a vision of the true origins of Demacia. From the Rune Wars to how mages and non-mages alike worked hand in hand to create their nation, to even the very winged protectors they so revered. This made Sylas realize that Morgana was indeed the second half of the winged protectors. He asked her why she remained hidden and not returned to Demacia. Morgana replied that if she does, so would her sister Kael, and Demacia is not yet ready for her judgment. She then bestowed him the very weapon she mentioned from their first meeting, a feather from her sister's wings, and uses it to grant him a blessing, the ability to share the very vision she just showed him. Back in the great city, with Lord Eldred now dead, Wisteria was made the new leader of the Mage Seekers. As her first act, she requested from King Jarvan IV that the Mage Seekers be given more immense power to deal with the mages. In other words, to execute any mages and their sympathizers without trial. Driven by blind vengeance of his own, Jarvan approved, but this meant his lover Shyvana would be a target. He tries to convince her to stay, promising to protect her, but Shyvana sees no future for herself in Demacia now. Jarvan doubts his ability to be king without her by his side, so Shyvana suggested he leaves with her, but he cannot abandon his people. She tells him that he does not have to be a ruthless king, but he fears that it is now just too late. After Sylas's meeting with Morgana, he gathered what's left of the mages, all of whom filled with doubt. Despite their feelings of failures and mourning, Sylas presented them all the white feather that emitted a bright light like a star. As the rebels looked towards it, they saw the same vision that Morgana had shared to Sylas. Now armed with this revelation, Sylas and his rebels would focus on saving mages instead of taking revenge on the Mage Seekers. After taking time for planning, one of Sylas's first acts was to make his way to the town of Meltridge. Despite the populace of the area fearing him, the citizens now feared the Mage Seekers more. The townsfolk even began their own revolt against them. Wisteria informs Garen that they have evidence that Lux is sheltering quote-unquote terrorist mages in Terabithia. She believes that Lux has been radicalized by Sylas and must be stopped before she can harm anyone. Fearing for the life of his sister, Garen made his way to the refugee camp in Terabithia to warn her about Wisteria's coming attack. Back in Miltridge, Sylas made his way into the town square and stood before its people. He then harnessed the magical powers of Morgana's feather to spread the vision that was shared to him by her, now revealing the true history of Demacia. He was given information of a mage-seeker scientist named Hesbeth had begun to accelerate the cruel human experiments which led to a covert attack by Sylas and his close ally Gideon, a former mage-seeker grown disillusioned by their cause. They made their way back into the great city, scaling the walls, and entered the compound. After fighting through hordes of his experiments, Sylas finally corners Hesbeth. The scientist tries to beg for his life, but Sylas refuses to listen and ends his life, slaying the mad scientist. The rebel revolutionaries celebrated this major victory, but it was shortly interrupted when Lux arrived. She came to their hideout to extend an olive branch after she has seen how far Sylas has come to earn the Veiled Lady's blessing. She requested for Sylas and his rebels to help repel the coming attack led by Wisteria. Sylas agrees, and formalized the alliance between their two groups. The assault on Terbicia begins quickly, starting with a group of Silver Ring riders attacking the North Gate, which was soon repelled. On multiple fronts, many soldiers and mage seekers clashed with the rebel mages. Sylas then receives news that Wisteria took to a nearby fort, prompting him to lead his own assault with his most loyal supporters. Meanwhile, the mage seekers begin to corner Lux, until her older brother Garen intervenes. He apologizes for abandoning her and promises to help her and always support her. He tells her that Jarvan has ordered the Mage Seekers to stand down, but does not think Wisteria will listen. Together, the Crown Guard siblings defend the city against the influx of Mage Seekers. In the fort, Sylas and Wisteria locked into a clash, a battle of magic and anti-magic. Ear-numbing sounds of arcane spells reverberated from powerful spells, shaking their surroundings. Wisteria mocked Sylas's lack of control of magic, but as she ran her mockery, she herself began to lose control of her own magical powers. This led to Sylas's mind to be consumed into her mindscape. There, he saw the torturous life of her childhood, where Eldred and Hesbeth indoctrinated her into hating magic, despite her being born a mage. As their fight continues, Sylas acknowledges that Wisteria is beyond redemption. But before he could deliver a final blow, Wisteria offered Sylas one last chance to recant, but Sylas refused, and says her fate was worse than prison. As one last act to show defiance, Wisteria unleashes her full power in a chaotic arcane beam. Sylas then absorbed and redirected her spell against her. Defeated, Wisteria lays dying on the grounds they fought, but even in her soon death, she still holds onto the Mage Seeker doctrine that was torturously embedded in her mind. As she drew her last breath, the raging flames finally calmed, and the smog of destruction cleared. The mages were victorious in the Battle of Terbicia. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the mages began to rebuild their lives in the settlement with the assistance from the two Crown Guard siblings. Back in the great city, King Jarvan IV has come to terms with the mistakes of what the laws of Demacia has done to them. This led the king to pen a royal decree that finally disbanded the Mage Seeker Order, the very body that was responsible for the anti-magical doctrine to be so ingrained into the kingdom's society. To make further amends, Jarvan IV declares Terbicia a safe haven for mages to be governed by Lux. In the presence of both Crown Guard siblings, Jarvan further promises to protect magical beings, and declares anyone who still support the Mage Seekers his enemy. This was not only to ensure he met his late father's wishes, but also in the hopes that Shyvana, who fled Demacia during the uprising, would come back to him. Back in the Dark Forest, Sylas and his revolutionaries celebrated their victory, but still further mourned their fallen for their sacrifices. One of Sylas's loyal men noted that they will need more allies, because despite royal concessions to help the mages in the kingdom, many folks within the different levels of Demacian society still held the Mage Seeker doctrine in close fists. There's still much work to be done. Once the jubilations was over, at the suggestion from one of his most loyal supporters, Sylas then made the decision to venture to the north. The lands of eternal winter where the cold is the enemy, and where the man and beast hunts for every scrap for survival. As Sylas bid his farewells, he promised that he shall return with more powerful allies to aid in their cause. He then set forth on his journey to the far north of the Freljords, all for a better Demacia.